Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 10th of August 2021. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics here. Great to have you on board, and thank you very much for spending some of your Tuesday evening with me. This is a very important show tonight. We're going to talk politics, and like it or not, politics is a critical part of everybody's lives, so this is an important conversation. Just before I get going, I'll just put up my normal caveats. No, we're not giving financial advice in any way on this show tonight. Do please play nice in the chat room. No racial slurs. We moderate the stream. And of course, we encourage people to chat and share ideas. But no racial slurs, please. We will mute those. This is as of the 10th of August 2021. If you're watching in replay, do use that Walk the World to get my attention. Always lots of things going on in the chat. That's the best way to make sure that you get to ask your question. And if you also want to make sure that your question goes to the top of the list, then you can use Super Chat, which is enabled, or indeed if you'd like to make a contribution to the channel. We don't do this for money, we do it basically for interest, but there is a cost involved in doing this, so if you'd like to support us, that's also great. And without further ado, I'm going to bring now Victor in. Victor, are you there?
I'm there. I'm here.
Eureka, it worked. I always hold my breath when I push the button, and thank you very much for coming on this evening and
thank you for having me. It's always great fun.
Spending some time tonight. Got a lot of people with lots of questions for you. But look, I think a good place to start would be just a little bit about you and, why this new party and those sorts of things will be a good place to start. And then I want to go into more detail because I think these two things are connected, right? What's wrong with politics now, and why do you think things need to change?
Yeah. Well, I'm a barrister. I've in recent years I've been running a thing I founded called the Refugee Law Project because I found that as much pro bono work as I wanted to do for refugees wasn't going to cut it because there's so many thousands of them going through without legal help. And so we founded this Refugee Law Project, the idea being to bring together some of the country's best administrative law barristers, refugee barristers, and final year law students, and put together a body that could offer representation to everyone. We actually succeeded in doing that in a relatively short space of time, in under 2 years. But we found that the playing field was so uneven that there was very little chance of us actually succeeding to get visas for people who were seeking asylum in this country. I won't bore you with all the details of the technicalities in the law, but it's a very uneven playing field. The upshot was that I started to realise in a big hurry that the only way people who are seeking asylum in this country were going to get a decent shake was through political change. And that was one of the driving factors that got me into the party. I suppose every one of the other founding members had their own personal motivations, but I think what was common to all of us is that we saw a terrible malaise in politics. And I guess that's your what's wrong with politics. And I think question, and I think you can explain it this way. What we observed was a very, very corrupt government. I mean, undoubtedly the most corrupt government we've ever seen at the federal level, and an ineffective opposition, and a media, because of the monopolisation of media in the hands of Rupert Murdoch and a few others, no ability for the normal savings that the press can bring when a government is straying from the path of righteousness, if you like. So it looked pretty hopeless. We observed that there were 3 million people living below the poverty line. We observed that refugees were being locked up for the rest of their life. I'm talking about people who've never committed a crime just because they couldn't be sent home to their home country. So they got locked up here for the rest of their lives. We saw businesses, small businesses, struggling against impossible odds. We just saw a country that we didn't recognise. And more importantly, we saw a country that was at risk of sliding into becoming the new Argentina. And so we decided that somebody had to do something about this, and we were that somebody. So that's how we came about, I suppose.
And, it's interesting because clearly you believe in the political system and the political process, right? Because you've created a political party. There are lots of other fragmented minor parties all over the place in Australia, right, at various flavours. And you've got the two major parties, which seem to me to be very much covering the same ground with just slightly minor, bits around the edge. So I guess the question is, do you believe in the political process? And how is it going to change the political process by creating a new party?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think the answer is that the time has come, not just in this country, but all over the world. Now, you will have seen someone like Macron in France, who comes in 6 months before the general election in France with a brand new party, En Marche, that really says nothing more than that we are not politicians and we are going to get rid of, it's almost like a version of Trump's going to clean up the swamp. And Macron swept in with a grassroots party. I mean, he had some political experience himself, and we don't. But he swept in with a grassroots party that eliminated 4 major parties that had been around since the Franco-Prussian War. Now, Trump's an example of someone else who said, look, nobody's trusting the politicians. I'm going to do a job for you. Now, we don't like Trump, but it doesn't detract from the concept that if someone stands up and says, we are different, we believe in what's happening, we believe that what's happening is destroying our country, and you can't trust the politicians anymore, and you can trust us, then people respond to that. Now, you've got to be a trustworthy person yourself. I think Macron is. I think Trump is not. Right? So it begs the question: how do people trust us? And how can they trust that we're not just doing a Trump? I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. That was actually going to be my next question, right?
Thank you. And I can understand this because there's an enormous cynicism out there that's been engendered by this horrible corruption in politics. And when you say two parties that just seem to be a little different around the edges, I mean, I can't even see the difference anymore. Every time the government introduces some piece of horrendous legislation, the Labor Party rolls over and supports it. And their supporters say crazy things like, well, they weren't going to be able to vote it down anyway, so they might as well vote for it and keep themselves as a small target. So you've got this situation where they're saying if we say nothing and do nothing and agree with everything the government says, in other words, totally abrogate our position as an opposition, then people who voted for Morrison last time will say, well, there's this, we voted for Morrison, but there's this other party, they don't do anything or say anything or have any policies, and they agree with the government every time. Why don't we change to them? It's an insane thing. So there's a one-party system sort of thing. So naturally people are cynical. And when we put our hand up and say, well, we're not like that, how are they going to trust us? And I guess the answer is that, first of all, we are real people from the real world. Every one of us has a job. Every one of us has a career. Every one of us has been in that career for some time. And none of us has ever had any inclination to go into politics. And you can see that because none of us ever has. And we have our particular expertise that we bring to the benefit of the country. I think that's the first thing that could give people a little bit of confidence, because 80% of the current parliament, as I think you know, Martin, have had no job outside politics. It's people haven't had a real job, So they've gone to university, they've studied political science, they've joined the Liberal Party, they've worked their way up through from being dog's body up to some sort of branch secretary, and eventually they get a staffer job, and then they get a job. They get a job with a safe seat, and they know nothing about the real world. Now, we're not like, none of us is like that. The other thing is that we make ourselves available to people. So, for example, people think I'm crazy, but I constantly put my phone number up on Twitter. And when people ask this very question, and they say, oh, well, it all sounds very well. I've read your policies. The policies look good, but how can we tell? Now, I understand that sort of cynicism. And unless I'm willing to meet that head on, then how are people going to do it? So I typically put my phone number up and I say, well, mate, if you're worried or you're concerned or you'd like to find out, give me a ring. And most people get the fact that if you talk to someone one-on-one on a phone or on a Zoom or whatever the case may be, you know if that person's ridgy-dig or if they're dissembling, So that's something else we do. And we also, I guess, we put our money where our mouth is. So a lot of people say, and this is kind of the same question put another way, well, it's all very well to promise and say, but, what are you going to do when you get there? And we understand that. And our answer to that is, well, we're putting our money where our mouth is now, as far as we can, given that we don't have anyone in the parliament as yet, we're taking action. So, for example, Vanya Holt, who's one of our candidates, and myself, we're both ex-prosecutors, and we saw the police terminate the investigation of Christian Porter way ahead of time when they hadn't even done the absolute fundamentals like interview the accused or interview the alleged victim. And we got hold of the documents and we saw that there was a case there. So we have launched a private prosecution against Christian Porter for rape, and we have two former sex squad detectives, two women, and we have one of Australia's leading QCs, criminal QCs, leading the team. And this is a serious matter, and we're taking that on. And we're seeking to bring justice. And by bringing justice, I'm not saying that I'm alleging that Christian Porter is guilty. I'm just saying we're bringing justice in that fundamental sense of there's a case to answer. Let's put it before a judge and jury and see what they have to say. Now, the police weren't going to do that, and the DPP wasn't given the opportunity to do that because the police didn't give them a brief. So we're taking that on. We also have challenged the Liberal Party of Australia for using the word liberal in their name, because we are a real Liberal Party, as that term is understood around the world and has been for 200 years. And they make it very difficult for us by calling themselves a Liberal Party and behaving as ultra-conservative people, with the result that the word liberal has been perverted. And when we say we're a Liberal Party, people hear that and go, "Oh, you're a conservative." Now that's an absurd concept for anyone anywhere else in the world who understands that liberal and conservative are the two polar opposites. And it would have been an absurd idea in the 1950s under the party that Menzies founded, but now it's not. And so they're getting in the way of our proper march forward, if you like, as a political party, and we have challenged their right to use that. There's a section in the Electoral Act that says if you obtain your ongoing registration by fraud or misrepresentation, you can be deregistered. And that's what we're arguing they are doing on an annual basis. So I'm hoping if you put all those things together, then people will say, yeah, well, you are a bit different. You're giving it a go. You're putting yourself out there. You're taking proactive action. Maybe we can take a chance on you.
Yeah, very interesting. Now, the question I've got then, which sort of comes from the next logical step, which is, so what is the purpose of politics, right? What is the end goal? And to what extent is it really about the betterment of society rather than self-perpetuation?
Oh, well, it ought to be the betterment of society. To me, it almost sounds, I almost hear myself sounding like a bit of a romantic, harking back to better days, because I believe in democracy, like it's crazy. But, it's old and hackneyed, but if you're putting your hand up to go into politics, you should be putting your hand up to say, I'm a servant of the people. Not, I want to join this club where I can engage in corrupt practices and make lots of money. That is not the purpose. That is not the purpose of a political system, not a democratic political system anyway. And I guess that's what we want to bring back. Or not, we want to bring back the romantic notion of a democracy that works for the benefit of all people. And I guess our party, one of the things we say about ourselves, and this again is hackneyed and obvious, but it needs to be said. Our policies are based around the idea of achieving the best possible outcome for the most people. That ought to be, not these monstrous ideas that if we just throw refugees in prison, well, that'll protect us, and they can just rot in a dungeon like the man in the iron mask, or if we just throw 3 million people below the poverty line, that'll really benefit our society because, we won't have to worry about unions getting in the way and we won't have to worry about people clamouring, they can all just live out of their cars and the rest of us will be terrific. That is not the best possible outcome for the most people as far as we're concerned.
Right, so it's definitely thinking about it in terms of the betterment of society and the greatest good for the greatest proportion of society, if I can put it like that. So let's think then about so-called neoliberalism, right? Because neoliberalism is at the heart of the current policies and, frankly, political parties. I think both Labour and the current in power are very much neoliberals, which basically says the market's everything, right? Everything comes back to a dollar. Everything comes back ultimately to turning a dollar and driving. Now, what's your perspective? Do you think neoliberalism is right, or do you think that's where the seed of the problem actually lays?
I think that's exactly where the seed of the problem is. It's one of the most terrifying phenomena. I mean, students of history in 100 years' time will look back on that and say that it is one of the most clever and one of the darkest pieces of Machiavellian politics that's ever been perpetrated on this planet. You have a guy called Milton Friedman, and he wins the Nobel Prize for coming up with an idea that, if you just give a lot of money to the people at the top, then, that'll be better for the people lower down. It's called trickle-down economics. Now, the first time that was said, it must have been said, people must have just laughed, But fortunately for Friedman, he had two people in power in the two most significant Anglo-Saxon nations on earth, United Kingdom and America. He had Margaret Thatcher and he had Ronald Reagan. And whatever you think about them, they were clever politicians and they were charismatic personalities. And Margaret Thatcher stood up and said, "We can't spend a penny unless you give us the tax to spend," which is a complete distortion of what a sovereign government can and can't do. But she said that and people bought it, and economics faculties in universities started adopting it. And in due course, the world became a neoliberal world where that lie that Friedman told and that lie that she told and Reagan, supported it, that became the orthodoxy. So now you've got a situation where if I say to someone, look, a sovereign government can invest in whatever it wants to invest in, providing there's the underlying capacity to be productive. If I say that to people and I say, and you can do that before you get any taxes. Indeed, you don't even need to tax for that purpose. Taxation is there for other purposes. I mean, they look at you like you're a Martian, So strongly has the orthodoxy taken hold. And if it only took hold of one side of politics, then you would hear a counterbalancing voice, but it hasn't, And here in Australia, it was introduced by a Labor Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, and it was perfected by a Labor Prime Minister, Paul Keating. So there is no other way to do economics as far as the average person concerned. And it's a wonderful, wonderful system if you want to make the rich richer and the poor poorer, because every time some group puts their hand up and starts clamouring about, there's a need to get the homelessness off the street. There's a need to provide better support to carers. There's a need to solve unemployment. They go, oh, well, but we don't have the money. We can't afford it. noting that we can always afford to have major tax cuts for large corporations. We can always afford to, spend another couple of billion on a submarine if that's what we want to do. So it's neoliberalism has, or neoclassical economics, however you want to put it, it has been the most successful piece of evil that's ever been perpetrated on the world that I can think of. Because, when Genghis Khan is running through raping and pillaging, the people that are getting raped and pillaged, they don't say, oh, that's a good thing. Isn't this lovely? What a lovely system. He's raping and pillaging us, right? But when the neoclassical, neoliberal rulers tell the people, oh, sorry, you're out there homeless, you're out there unemployed, you're sleeping on somebody else's couch, you're doing that because that's just the way the world is and we can't do anything about it, unfortunately. Or worse still, they tell them it's your fault, mate, for being in the situation you're being in. People accept that. And, it's now been so successful for so long that you have a situation where young people don't know of any other option. So when I tell them about we want to get back to the full employment of the Menzies era and all that sort of thing, they think I'm some sort of fantasist. So it's a big struggle. But if somebody doesn't do it, if it goes on any longer, then the 3 million who are below the poverty line will be 6 million below the poverty line, will be 12 million below the poverty line. And then how are we any different from a South American dictatorship? With Peter Dutton proposing laws to raid journalists and put asylum seekers in jail and hold secret trials and the Labor Party accepting everything he puts forward. And 12 million people below the poverty line. Why is that any different from a South American dictatorship? So that's the big danger, I think.
Right, very interesting. And, I want to come on to another question in a second. Let me just do one thing first, and that is just to say to Smooth Operator, we run a little quiz as we go along here. So Smooth has put up tonight's question. So, folks, there is Smooth's question. Name the pop star worth $1.7 billion whose fortune comes from lingerie, music and acting, but the majority is from 40 different foundation shades which were brought in more than $550 million in its first year. So there you go, a little bit of fun. I'll leave you to work on that on the chat. And look, I want to, Victor, come back to the next obvious question, which is that clearly, therefore, there is a base economic discussion to be had here, right? Which is basically saying the fundamental economic tenets that is driving neoliberalism and the Treasury and the Reserve Bank and all those other players now are actually taking us into a cul-de-sac, right? There has to be a different way of economic thinking. So my question to you is, where does your economic thinking come from? Who are you tapping into? Because you need some different, ideas in there, I would have thought.
Yeah, well, we're practitioners of what's called modern monetary theory, which is an unfortunate term because it's not modern. It's kind of an updated version of that same Keynesianism that FDR used to get us out of the Depression, and Menzies used to give us the most prosperous period in Australia's history, and that Rudd used to keep us out of the GFC, and that even Frydenberg used under pressure to stop people starving to death, although they brought that to an end. So it's not modern, and it's not monetary really, it's fiscal. And I don't think it's a theory, it's a fact because, it's proven to be right through all those examples I gave you, whereas neoclassical economics has proven constantly to be wrong because trickle-down economics has been proven in 1,000 cases not to work. So that's what we work off, and that's a brand new system, and it enables us to look at a budgetary situation that is beneficial to human beings, not some theoretical thing like GFC, where you can, be the richest country in the world and 90% of your people are starving, but it doesn't matter because, GFC, the balance of payments, the balance of trade and all that sort of thing. So anyway, we operate off that. We operate off that, and it enables us, as I say, to look at people's real situation and say, well, there's 3 million of you below the poverty line. Can we get you a job? And the answer is we can. We can under this system, and it cannot be done under any other system. I mean, all the Labor Party can say, for example, is, well, we're going to open a factory here and create 450 jobs. We're going to do something over there and create another 900 jobs. But, it's a drop in the ocean. And even the Greens, by the way, practice neoclassical economics. So we're the only ones out there that can say, look, we'll give you a job guarantee scheme. And the way that works is we'll fund that federally, and there will be jobs created locally. All the institutions at a local level, such as councils, NGOs, theatre companies, community organisations, anybody who has a job that they want done, and they usually have to rely on volunteers that are irregular and they can't be sure that they'll be there on time. That becomes a job, and that's a job we pay for, and that goes into the job bank. And when somebody turns up and says, I want a job, we match that person to the best job for them in the job bank. It's not compulsory. It's not work for the dole. It'll be paid at a good living wage, which will be somewhere around the median wage. And that is limited only by one's imagination. So, for example, a person can turn up and say, well, look, I'm a carer. You don't have to find me a job. I've got a job. I work 40, 60 hours a week caring for this person, and I'm on this terrible starvation pension. We go, sure, you are a real worker. You'll get a real worker's job. Or someone can come and say, oh, look, I'm a real artist, a painter, a writer, or something like that, and I'm struggling, and I'm barely making ends meet, and I want to be paid a decent wage to create because I'm building the glory of this country in art. We'll say, sure, there's a job. And every one of those people you put back to work, every dollar you put in their hands gets spent and respent across the economy, stimulating small and large business alike as it goes. And for those people who cannot live without the idea of there must be some tax involved, it'll come back to you as a mountain of tax, because you've created wealth, and out of wealth comes taxation. So we can do that. We can, and because we can do that, we can offer this country genuinely. We can offer this country the best public education system in the world, the best health system in the world. We can guarantee that there will be real full employment. By that I mean, 1.2, 1.4% that Menzies had, never higher than 2%. As we've said on another program, not the 5% that they say it is, but it's really 15, because the other 10% are working 1 or 2 hours a week and are getting counted in the statistics as being employed. We can take this country and make it again the lucky country, but we can only do that because we look at the reality of what economics actually is and what a sovereign government can actually do, as opposed to the lie that's been propagated over the last 40 years through neoliberal economics.
So just following up on that, are you therefore really advocating a universal basic income? Is that the fundamental tenet of what you're talking about? Or
no, we're not. We're not. Because as I understand the universal basic income, it says that we will pay a basic wage. Let's say, I don't know what the UBI advocates would say, but let's say they say $30,000 a year or something like that. And you'll get that, or $40,000 a year or whatever they say, I don't know. But you will get that whether you're working or whether you're not working. And you can choose to work or you can choose not to work. Or maybe you can't work. But it's all irrelevant to the UBI advocate, because everyone will get the same amount of money. Now, what we say, first of all, is that's not as productive a spend economically as you would get out of investing in putting somebody back to work I mean, paying somebody not to do anything, it just a matter of common sense will tell you that is not as productive. That does not have the multiplier effect across the economy of someone who's actually creating goods and services. But in some ways, more importantly, it ignores the reality of human nature. Just like communism was a wonderful thing on paper, but it ignored the reality of human nature, and that was its undoing. UBI does the same. So in the real world, what would happen is that person A, who is working 40 hours a week and who sees person B, his or her neighbour, sitting on the couch for the same 40 hours watching television, and they're both getting the same amount of money, would create resentment and dissension and division in society. So what we want to do is we want to avoid that by saying, which I think actually at the end of the day, our system is the best of the job guarantee, the JGS and the UBI, because we say, okay, if you want a job, you'll get it and it'll be at a good living wage. So let's say, for argument's sake, just so we can see the numbers, $57,000 a year, somewhere around the median income. You want that, you'll get it. Now, if you can't work, then because you're old or sick or whatever, you won't be asked to live on the $20,000 a year that the government currently gives you. You'll get somewhere around double that, somewhere around $40,000 a year, which will enable you to live comfortably because, of course, you don't have the expenses of the person who's going out to work and so on. And then if there's nothing wrong with you but you choose not to work, now Professor Bill Mitchell is a big advocate of the job guarantee schemes, says, well, if the bastards don't want to work, then pay them nothing, We're not really prepared to do that, but we would probably pay them $20,000 or $25,000 so that they, were not going to be homeless and struggling. And you get a situation that has equity to it, and the opportunity for people to advance themselves who want to, and the opportunity for people who can't advance themselves not to be punished for that, and the opportunity for people who just want to be absolutely lazy not to starve to death, So that's got elements of UBI in it, but it's fundamentally, I hope, a lot more realistic in the real world.
So I guess the other question then is, you obviously need to have an economy that is growing and creating more true value, right? The question then is what trajectory on growth is feasible, optimal. Yeah. And I bring it over the top here, the questions which, of course, the IPCC just came out on in terms of, well, we've got some significant issues in terms of climate change and, all the issues there. And basically they've come out and said, look, the way we're running the world at the moment is not sustainable. So what's the growth trajectory and the growth pattern? And what's the, are we wrong to think about growth? Do we need to actually change the equation and say a more steady state view rather than perpetual growth?
Yes, we believe so. The idea that you have this graph that's pointing to the top right-hand corner of the thing going off into infinity, and nobody says, when does the planet run out of stuff, is just silly. The days of that are gone. It has to be steady state or donut economics, as it's often called. You've got to build into that. So it's the perfect question for you to ask, because you've got to build into the stuff that I've just talked about another dimension, and that's the dimension of the steady state. So you don't say, well, to give a silly example, I suppose, you don't create jobs in the fossil fuel industry. What you do is you create jobs that are self-sustaining, jobs that are not polluting, jobs that can increase the wealth of the nation without increasing the damage that wealth can create. So at the moment, we've got a situation where I mean, it's insane that it is in a country that should be full of intelligent people running it. But, we're destroying the planet. We're just destroying the planet. We're destroying it very quickly. If that was getting people jobs and, spreading the wealth, at least we'd all die happy, I suppose. But it doesn't even do that, So we would have to build in recycling, reusing, clever stuff, and of course that requires a lot of planning, but it's not beyond the ability of woman or man to do that sort of high-level planning. So, the obvious thing is that we would invest in, along with the job guarantee scheme, we would invest in renewable energies and create a swag of jobs in that people that could be employed as private sector jobs or could be part of the job guarantee scheme or in partnership with the private sector or whatever model we set out with. But I mean, I just completely agree with you. The time for turning a blind eye to what's happening to our planet, well, it's long since gone. Sometimes I think that, there's about 24.5 million people that really understand this. And the only people that don't understand it are the people that run the country and a few owners of fossil fuel corporations and 20 or 30 ratbags who live somewhere and, say, oh, it's all a lie. I mean, Greta Thunberg came out and just yesterday, I think, and said, we got 5 years. What are you going to do about it? And there's a real chance that she's right. And I think that report today may have spoken about that. I haven't read it, but in a way that saddens me because, as part of our policy, we have a net zero emission policy for 2035. But it may be too late. And the chances of us getting into government this time round are nil. The earliest we could possibly get into government is 2025, and that would, on Thunberg's analysis, that would give us a year, to do it. So.
And it's really challenging, right? Because at the moment there is a very strong political alignment with big industry, right? And, particularly the mining sector here in Australia and other sectors too, who are very strongly advocating no change or minimal change. We've got ScoMo's position, which is sort of wobbling around a little bit, I think because of the international pressure, but basically is almost no change from where we were, right? And then playing lip service and frankly playing fast and loose with the statistics, claiming that everything is marvellous and we're keeping all our commitments, right? And then if you look at what is happening in the UK or even now in the US, there are steps being taken to at least head somewhere. But even those steps, according to the report that came out, is insufficient to be able to actually tackle the quantum of the challenge. And the other point there, of course, is it's not actually necessarily the Western advanced countries that are going to be hit first, right? It's a lot of people in the Pacific who are going to be basically swamped in a few years' time. And then the other point there, of course, if China and the US as big emitters don't actually start significantly changing their game, then it's all over Red Rover anyway. I mean, this is a big, complicated issue, but, it's got to take leadership. And I think, frankly, one of my issues is where is the leadership going to come from, because it's not coming from the current political organisations in Australia.
No, well, it's going to come from us. And if that sounds arrogant and megalomaniacal, I'm sorry, but it's going to come from us or it's not going to come from anywhere. Well, I'm sorry. The Greens have some claim to, but even the Greens, I can't believe you're a party called the Greens and you don't have a water policy. In this country, with water being proprietized and put on the open market and sold to Canadian super companies and Chinese corporations and being sold back to farmers at twice the price, and the Murray-Darling system, the arteries of our nation are dry, and politicians selling the water to one another double the market price and making bumper profits. And and the Greens have no policy to deal with this, So if the leadership doesn't come from us, it's not going to come, Yeah. That's why we feel this enormous sense of urgency, and why just harking back a little bit to can people trust us? I think one of the things that's trustworthy about us is we tell it as it is. Even sitting here tonight, I sense that I'm saying things that no other politician would say, because they all dance around trying not to offend anybody and not to say anything out of place or not to give the media anything to beat them with, or, and we don't do that. If we can give Rupert Murdoch some sticks to beat us with, good luck to him, So we don't see another. Well, no, we don't. We don't see another leadership. What we do see another strand of hope, and that strand of hope is from the voices of movements that are springing up. I think there's one in now 80 of the 151 federal seats around the country, and they're all promoting the possibility of getting independent candidates elected. And that's wonderful. And some of the independent people that are already in there are absolutely fantastic, like Wilkie and Haynes and Stegel. These people are terrific. And if we get a lot more of them, that's great. But by definition, this is certainly not a criticism of them, but by definition, they cannot drive policy because they are a coterie of individuals with different agendas. You unfortunately, in the democratic system, you need a party that says this is what we stand for, so that people know what they're voting for, and that's why I think it's us or nothing.
Look, I'm going to come back in a second to the voters and how voters decide, but I just want to pick up this from Jason. Jason, thanks for the super chat. Really appreciate it. Does Victor think more transparency should apply to benefits given by the government to fossil fuel industry versus renewable sources?
Oh, yeah. There's got to be more. Totally. Absolutely agree, Jason. And there has to be more transparency on everything. One of the great evils that I suppose I forgot to talk about, and God knows why I forgot to talk about it when we were saying what's wrong with the political system, is the donation system. So, underlying, I was talking about, that we become a one-party system, and that one-party system is protected by Rupert Murdoch and so on. But it's driven by the fact that the donors donate vast sums of money to the major parties, and they donate the same to each, pretty much the same to each, usually a little bit more to the Liberal Party than the Labor Party, but they both go into the next election with $100 million each from these people. And these people want value for their money. So, and we don't know. We don't know till, I don't know how long is it, Martin, till after the election that we find out, when it's too late, how much money was donated. So we've got a policy for, and so do the Greens, in fairness, of donating in real time, and we have that now. Like we have any donation over $1,000 we have up on our website. We don't have many of them, but they're up there, sort of thing. I think everything is covert in the current political system, even to the point. Everything the government does is covert, but now they're introducing these secret trials that they justify on the basis of national security. That's the next level of covert action. But yes, it needs to open up. The public needs to know everything. It's their government, for God's sake. They elected, they put it in power. It is still, at least theoretically, a democracy. So you put somebody in power, you give them that enormous power. You have a right to know what they're doing with the money, and not just with the money, but with everything else they do.
Well, I just want to sort of pick up a specific example, right? A certain number of car parks that were actually used as part of the last election campaign, right? As a classic example of them basically thinking that taxpayers' money is somehow their money to be used anywhere they want to basically pork barrel the election. How good is that?
Well, that is corruption. So I mean, these guys have a terrific. I think they invented the word rort because it somehow downgrades it to something like a misdemeanor, But it's an act of corruption. Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, is charged with corruption, and that corruption is about him doing exactly that thing, taking government money or public money and putting it in places that will benefit his election campaign. Elsewhere in the world, that is a jailable offence, and they just go, oh no, you hear Morrison say, oh well, the ministers had their job to do and they made their decisions, and I don't know anything about it, and and the press gallery jump up and down, and then we move on to the next news cycle and so on. It's not all about Murdoch. It's also about a very fast news cycle where no matter how, everything gets chewed up, no matter how minor or terrible or huge it is, it occupies the same space in the news cycle, and we move on to something else. So yeah, absolutely, that is not only not transparent, but it's dead set corrupt.
Well, talking about corruption, right now there is no federal ICAC.
Yeah.
Right? Should there be?
Oh, absolutely. We've got this really interesting situation at the moment where we proposed a federal ICAC, and suddenly everybody's got an ICAC. The Greens have got an ICAC and Labor's got an ICAC. Helen Haynes has an ICAC, but that was not in response to us. In fairness to her, that was something that was happening simultaneously. And we developed the term, what you need is an ICAC with teeth. And by that we meant an ICAC that, can actually put people behind bars. And now everybody's got an ICAC with teeth because that's now the phrase. But actually, when you examine them, there are no teeth at all. The Greens model and worse, the Labor model are just talking shops. If you look at the Greens legislation, for goodness sake, they're going to employ 400 functionaries just to discuss things, and then at the end of the day, they can say, oh, well, we make a recommendation to the New South Wales Police that they follow up on Christian Porter, and they just laugh, and don't, and it just gets you nowhere. Now, what we're proposing is a federal body, an administrative body called the ICAC, that will have power to investigate and prosecute not only politicians, but also judges and bureaucrats, because that's the other two arms of government. This is left out of the models by the other people. And not only who have committed criminal offences, but who have abused their power or been in dereliction of their duty. Now, the others only cover criminality. Now, covering criminality doesn't really help because criminality can be prosecuted now. It just isn't, because the federal police never take any action, against these people. So it's creating a body at enormous expense to do nothing and replicate powers that are already there and not being used. So there'll be two sets of powers that are not being used. Whereas ours looks beyond pure criminality and beyond pure corruption, where one minister sells water to another minister at twice the market price, beyond that sort of financial corruption, into dereliction of duty and abuse of power. Because, if we think about it, illegality is not a good test. Slavery, apartheid, and the concentration camps were all perfectly legal, and yet no one in this world would dispute that they were terrible abuses of power, terrible dereliction of duty on the part of the people that should have been governing the country to let those things happen. And those people deserve to face prosecution as much as anybody else. I mean, Peter Dutton has taken a section of the Migration Act that was designed to hold people in detention for a couple of weeks so that they didn't get lost in the system, And he has utilised that, he has contorted that into an ability to lock people away literally for the rest of their lives. But he stayed within the law. This is legal. But it is the most monstrous abuse of power since apartheid, and since slavery even, you know. So we have this body, and it investigates and it prosecutes, and then, of course, to be constitutionally appropriate, the separation of powers, there would be a separate judicial organ, a court called the Federal Court for the Prosecution of Corrupt Practices, and that would be where the prosecutions would be launched, and there would be judge and jury trials. Judges appointed, new appointees, so there's not any risk that one of the people that comes before, you know, you can make it part of the federal court, but there's a risk that if you're prosecuting a politician, they'll come before a judge that they appointed, you know. So a brand new court with new judges and juries, most importantly of all, juries, because, you know, anyone can be corrupted, but it's almost impossible. Well, it is impossible to buy a jury. Our ICAC will be retrospective, what's more, so that the 900 odd offences that have been committed by this government that have been identified in that wonderful document by the chasers, and all the other abuses of power that don't even come into that, they will be prosecuted, and people will be put behind bars. We have a phrase that we use all over social media: we're putting the bastards behind bars. Now, we come under some criticism for that, but we come under a lot more praise than we come under criticism. And that's because I think people understand intuitively that if you've lost faith in the political system, you just go along and you vote because you're told you have to vote, but nothing changes. There needs to be a circuit breaker. So if Joe Bloggs goes along and he says, well, you know, the new Liberals have promised to actually put these bastards behind bars, which really must happen, so I'm going to vote for them. And Joe Bloggs and all the other Joe Bloggses vote for us, and we get into government and we institute this thing and we put them behind bars. Then Joe Bloggs sits in his living room and he says, you know, it's my vote that did this. These criminal people that have got away with it for decades, you know, it's my vote that put them behind bars. And when people see that, then they see that democracy works and they get faith back in democracy. And no amount of talking shops going, oh, cluck, wasn't that terrible what so-and-so did? And wasn't that terrible what so-and-so did? And we recommend that somebody should do something about it. Oh, well, there it goes behind the filing cabinet. You know, that's not going to give anybody back their faith in democracy. And you know, as a barrister, as a lawyer, I understand how very serious it is to propose imprisoning people, and especially to imprison people with retrospective laws. I'm not saying for a moment that I or anybody in our party doesn't realise how deadly serious that is. But if it's the only way to restore the democracy, then it must be done. You know what I'm saying?
And just picking that out a little further, right? Because you mentioned Dutton and, you know, what he's done there. But we have no Bill of Rights in Australia, right? We actually have no rights, it seems to me, that are actually articulated anywhere clearly. It's all very fuzzy. So do we need a Bill of Rights?
Oh, absolutely. For many, many years, we've got a section in the Constitution called Section 75(5), which enables a person who feels, I suppose, to put it crudely, to feel wronged by a government or a government official to take legal action against that government. For a long time, lawyers and judges in this country said, well, we don't really need a Bill of Rights because Section 75(5) will protect us. But it's been trampled on, absolutely trampled on by governments and the judiciary that they've appointed. And it highlights the fact that we are odd man out in the civilised international community. I think all modern Western democracies have some form of a Bill of Rights. And if we had a Bill of Rights, then attempts to put innocent people in jail for the rest of their lives because it's convenient would be tested against that Bill of Rights, which, of course, would have in it the right to freedom from arbitrary detention, as it's called. We don't have anything. We don't have a right of free speech. We don't have a right to live. The fact of the matter is that, well, this is not something the federal government can do, but it's a state matter. Let's say that a state government decided that a certain group of people could be shot dead on the street. They can make that law, and it's not illegal. It's not unconstitutional, And if the rest of the people thought that was okay, well, so we don't need to have, brown shirts and stormtroopers, because without a Bill of Rights, we can use the legal system to do what the storm. We don't have to burn down Parliament House. It's a travesty. Well, it's a travesty that we don't have one.
And it's interesting because I've spoken to people who've come to live in Australia, and they sort of assumed that there would be these things here, right? And then they sort of realise, oh, hang on a moment, it's not quite as straightforward. And then the more you look at it, the more you realise there's just a gaping hole.
Well, there is, and the reason it's only recently been exposed is because we had a kind of social compact in this country. The people had different political opinions, and there were a lot of people that did very poorly out of this country, like First Nations people and earlier times women, for example. Lots of people who didn't do as well as they should have, but there was a compact not to do obscene things to people. And a lot of politicians. Somebody was drawing my attention to the fact today that in the 80s, two things happened at different points of time in the 80s in relation to LGBTQI people back then. So the Attorney General McClelland, under the Labor government, he got hold of 120 pieces of federal legislation and amended them to make sure that LGBTQI people didn't suffer disadvantages under the law compared to somebody else. Now, he didn't do that because he was under political pressure from that group or from anyone. In fact, most people didn't even know he was doing it. He just did it because it was the right thing to do. Similarly, when AIDS was rampaging and there was all this homophobia coming out, the health minister of the time, was it Blewett? I can't remember. Anyway, whoever it was, got the government to pass laws to prevent persecution of homosexual people because of this fear that everybody had. Now, there was no pressure on him to do that. In fact, the pressure was all the other way. But he did the right thing, and by and large, people did the right thing. Well, and that's, I guess, a matter of opinion on the individual case. But if some minister had said, this country really needs 10% unemployment so that we can be financially viable, or this country really needs to be protected by putting all these thousands of people who have committed no crime in prison for the rest of their life because they've committed the horrendous fault of seeking asylum, the outcry from the opposition, from the media, would have been so enormous that, well, they wouldn't have dreamt of doing it in the first place because they'd know what that outcry would be, So the compact is broken down. And all the smugness of the lawyers that I grew up with had said, well, we're part of the Westminster system, we have all these conventions, we don't need a Bill of Rights, we've got Section 75(5) of the Constitution. What's been proven is that if you don't put precautions in place, like a Bill of Rights, sooner or later, someone will take advantage of that. I mean, there was, of course, one of the big conventions was ministerial responsibility, and that entailed that if something significant went wrong, even if it wasn't really your fault, you resigned, and we all know in the past ministers resigning because they got given a bottle of champagne that they shouldn't have taken and this sort of thing. Now they get caught out doing the most horrendously corrupt things, the car parks rorts, the sports rorts, the water rorts, the Watergate, I think they call it. You've got all these things. And the ministerial responsibility is gone. There's not even prime ministerial responsibility. I mean, how Morrison can stand there and blame his own ministers and his own backbenchers and anybody else he can possibly blame, So, yes, Bill of Rights. Sorry, long-winded way to say yes, Bill of Rights.
Well, but you're touching on a very interesting thing here, right? Because the sorts of trends that you've been talking about, which is the erosion of the social compact and the assertion by those in power that they've got the ultimate right to do whatever they want, the consequences, it's not relevant, right? Isn't just something we see in Australia, right? We see it in the UK, we see it in other countries as well. So I guess there's a bigger question here. Is, what is it that's turning politics so sour, so very much myopically to, I guess, support the affluent and wealthy and support the large corporations against the rest of society? Because this is something which I'm seeing not just here in Australia but around the world. Is it driven by this new media cycle, or is there something else going on?
Oh, it's a combo of what we've talked about before. I think it's a combination of the neoliberalism, which is a dehumanising, an illogical and a dehumanising system that says we're going to give all the money to the rich people because that's the best way to keep the poor people from starving. And we watch them starve, and then they say the same thing again. And the other side of politics says the same thing again. So it's. I think neoliberalism is at the root of this, and then the corporate don't, and then so people lose their humanity. The people that are running the country, it's the absolute power corrupts absolutely. If you know that you can get away with anything, the temptation to get away with anything,
you will.
You will,
yeah.
And then the big corporations, they see a real opportunity here. They say, well, these people are willing to get away with anything. They're willing to do anything. Let's give them some money to give them an incentive to do those things in spades. So they say, here's $100 million. Just make sure that, we never introduce any sort of cap on emissions. And we'll make sure that you are re-elected again and again. It's a confluence of a whole range of terrible things coming together, but I think you touched on it. I think you nailed it, Martin, right at the beginning when you suggested that neoliberalism is at the root of it. It's a dehumanising thing. Yeah.
So then, but the other question is this, right? When voters go to cast their votes, right? To what extent do you think the voters actually ultimately, vote based on the interests of their hip pocket versus these broader issues of, societal equity and, all of those other things? Because if you go back to the Howard era, right, Howard was very effective in essentially getting re-elected by, just giving more money and saying, well, if you vote for me, you're going to get, more money, as it were. So I guess, do you think voters really have a conscience, or is it ultimately hip pocket?
I think hip pocket's part of it, but the flip side of that coin is that the Liberal Party of Australia talks about being, the party for small business, and they are anything but the party for small business. They favour the big end of town in a ridiculous fashion, and as we said before on another program, they burden the small business with crushing stuff so that they can never be secure, they can never move out of that into a middle-sized firm and so on. So you'd think people would work that out and say, hang on, so maybe my hip pocket isn't benefited So it's not purely about hip pocket, it's also about being conned. The problem is, and we get back to the same thing again, the problem is if you're smart enough to say, I don't think the Liberal Party's doing anything in my interest, I think they're just supporting their mates in the big end of town, well, I better vote for somebody else. Oh, Labor Party does exactly the same thing. You know, they've just passed the stage 3 tax cuts for the big end of town, you know, like, so where do you go? So I think that, yes, a little bit of hip pocket voting, a little bit of voting because you've been conned, but also I think the vast majority of voting is voting out of apathy, do you know? Because you don't see a choice. So what are you going to do? Well, you'll default to what your parents voted, I suppose, because, you know, they're your parents and maybe they know something that you don't know. So, you know, let's vote that way. That's why we're getting such an enormous swell of support from people, because we're offering them a different thing. No, you don't have to be poor. You don't have to be downtrodden. You don't have to be, you know, living out of your car. You don't have to be in prison when you've committed no crime. Suddenly there are alternatives, and I think people will take those up. So again, I'm sorry, I'm very long-winded, but I think most of the voting is out of apathy and habit.
Very interesting, because you see, I've got this theory that people aren't being treated as adults.
No,
right? What they're being is basically fed one-line, simplistic arguments, you know, from one side of politics, the other side of politics, but in fact the same messages, right? Actually, there is a need, I think, to handle people as adults and have more mature conversation. That's one of the reasons why DFA exists, right? Because my frustration was that there was no opportunity in the mainstream to have these more discursive conversations and to explore things and to, you know, turn it around and look at it. I'm a philosopher by training, right? And I'm interested in ideas and how ideas work and why people think what they think, right? Now, I've of the view that in the last decade, we've degraded the debate such that it has become just a very simplistic, you know, hip pocket conversation. But there's a bigger story here, right? Which is why this is such an interesting conversation to me, in terms of saying, no, there is an agenda here. There is a way of thinking here that's different. And actually it can benefit society, but it does take a different way of thinking. And that, for me, is the most interesting, you know, part of this discourse.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, you know, that old saying, there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. You know, what we're finding is that, yes, people have been talked down to. Yes, they've been treated like children. But you can't blame them for sort of rolling over and letting that happen when there's no alternative.
Yep.
But when you offer them an alternative, suddenly they're very intelligent adult people, you know, and they rise up and they do the most incredibly beautiful things. An example I keep quoting because it still touches me, you know, is a woman on Twitter who I don't know. I've never come across her before. She sent me a message and she said, you know, I love what you guys are doing and the policies, and you're giving us hope, et cetera, et cetera. She said, but I you know, I see you on shows like this and you know, podcasts and alternative media. She said, but you're not getting a good run in the big urban newspapers. She said, and you know, there are a lot of old people near me who still only read the print matter. So she says, I know they're not going to see you, and that breaks my heart. So what I've done is I go along on a Saturday morning to the local pharmacy because I know that's when they all go there to fill their prescriptions. And I stop every one of them as they go in, and I show them your website and I tell them about you, you know. Now, I believe that woman isn't the only person who's spreading the word, you know. If you've got an idea that resonates with people, they will get that word out there. The large parties have to spend $100 million to sell their message because there's nothing in their message that's worth selling. So you need a real lot of money put it across. But when you've got an idea that resonates with people, word of mouth is still the most powerful piece of advertising there is. I'm not sure how I got onto that, but anyway.
No, but this is interesting because it goes back to the concept of ideas and how ideas are propagated. And I tend to agree with you that there are ideas that are powerful enough to stand on their own 2 feet if they're allowed to run. Yes. The problem is that we often don't get the chance to see those ideas out in the big wide world because they're chopped off at the kneecaps by the mainstream media, or the politicians just have a script which they stick to, and that's all they ever talk about. So it's part of this saying. And look, on that front, as we come to the last 20 minutes or so of the show, I had a whole bunch of questions here, some of which are policy related. And what I perhaps like to do is just go through some of those policy issues in a little bit more brevity, because I think it was important to lay a foundation here, right?
Yes.
To explain why you're coming from where you're coming from and what you're trying to achieve. And I think we've done that hopefully quite well for the audience. But this was a question that was asked earlier on, which was that what's your thoughts on a national bank or two to compete against the big four plus the small ones? Do we have enough competition? Do the rules need adjusting? So this is about the banking system and the way that the banking system serves or doesn't serve us.
Yeah, well, the banking service, it doesn't service. They're the other bunch of crooks that are just pumping liquidity into the economy and pushing house prices up through the roof and creating a bubble that's going to have to burst. We have a policy for a public bank that will fund householders and will fund small business. And I think that's absolutely essential to put a circuit breaker in against the quadropoly that we have with the banks, with the private banks at the moment, who haven't learned anything from GFC or Royal Commissions or anything else.
And Citigroup, of course, is now being gobbled up by NAB, so effectively competition is being eroded even further.
Of course.
Okay, what about this one then? This is another starter for 10, as they say. Has Victor got any ideas on how to bring property prices under control or down?
What we're looking at with Professor Stephen Keen, who's our senior policy advisor on economics, is using his debt jubilee concept, where you would pay down the mortgage on a house. So if the house is worth $2 million and you've got a $1.8 million mortgage, the government would pay that down by, say, $200,000. Steve reckons that's about what we could tolerate. So that the amount owing would be now $1.6 million, and along with that, the house price would fall down to $1.8 million. The upshot being that the current homeowner has the same equity that they had before, and they pay off their home quicker, and at the same time, the house price is now considerably lower than it was, which would enable new buyers to get into the market. We also have to look at foreign ownership of houses and multiple ownership, and put some sort of grandfathering clause on the ability to deduct your costs against other income, all that sort of thing. But we think if we put that in place, we'll bring down house prices, or at the very least put a brake on, so that this ridiculous inflationary spiral will be brought to an end.
And two subsidiaries on that. Firstly, what does that say then about the RBA and APRA, the regulators? And secondly, what about public housing?
Yeah, well, the regulators are just part of that neoliberal system, and they've got to be brought into line with proper economic management, proper economic thinking. The Reserve Bank of Australia has three tenets that are written into their legislative constitution. The principal one being to ensure full employment. Now, they're in desperate dereliction of their duty. I mean, strictly speaking, they are prosecutable because of that. So they've got to be brought in line. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Public housing.
Oh, probably, yeah, and we have to invest very heavily in public housing. There's a wonderful there's a wonderful report that the government spent $80 million on that talks about how to integrate very fast rail with public housing schemes to bring people, to give people homes and also make them to put them in a position where they can reach employment very quickly. It's a wonderful policy, and it was suggested to us by somebody inside the government that we adopt it for ourselves because they said they're never going to do it. You know, it was one of those where they just, let's put this off to a report so we never have to think about it again. And it just turns out the report's absolutely marvellous. So we'll be taking that on board, I think, and making it our policy.
Very, very good. Okay, here's another quick one for you. This is from Jason. Be interested in hearing Victor's thought on the end point of the economic damage that's being created in New South Wales and the likely consequences of it dragging on for many months.
Oh, through COVID, I guess he's talking about. Yeah.
Correct.
Well, you know, gold standard Gladys, she needed to lock down a lot sooner. Fascinating thing is we've all become amateur epidemiologists. And I remember when the transport driver showed up with COVID and infected a few people, and we were all saying, she's got to lock it down. She's got to lock it down now, you know. And she left it, and she left it, and she left it. And I don't know whether she left it for several weeks or only 5 days. I'm not sure. I can't remember anymore. But she left it way too long. And look, 368 cases or something today. So it's not, and by the way, it's not just economic damage. You know, my wife is a doctor. She works in Campbelltown Hospital, and she's seeing people die every day. A lot of people are dying, and not just old people, you know. So, you know, it's a, I mean, in fairness, you know, would I have done better in that job? Would I have held out and gone, well, I'd like to say no, but, you know, under the pressure of a lot of people in small business saying, please, close down one more time, we're out of business.
So the issue here is, you know, the close down should have been quicker and the financial support for small business should have been quicker, I think.
Oh, well, you know, that's right. And this is all part of this neoliberalism. Oh, well, you've had your shot. We can't help you anymore. But we can give Jerry Harvey, you know, a fortune when he doesn't need it or deserve it, right? We've got no money to give to small business. We've got no money to give to the extra people that have been unemployed, but we've got a mountain to give to the big end of town. And, you know, just by the way, the wonderful Senator Rex Patrick introduced a clause into the legislation that would say that businesses over $10 million have to declare if they're taking government help. That was voted down jointly by the government and the opposition. So.
And it sort of goes to our point from earlier on about they're all on the same side, right? Those big guys, right? Yeah. So we'll go with this now quickly. Is Victor worried about government debt? And do you believe the tax system needs tweaking or a total overhaul?
No, government debt is part of the neoliberal myth. There is no debt at all. If Martin North borrows from Martin North, then Martin North can pay back Martin North whenever he likes. Now, the Australian government is nothing more or less than the Australian people. The Australian government borrows from the Australian people. It's the Australian people borrowing from themselves. And as Professor Bill Mitchell says, you can pay it off with one keystroke. The government doesn't even need to borrow at all. They could simply spend the money and directly and invest in whatever they want to do. That's the final part of the neoliberal myth that, you know, if you say, oh, but we're desperate and, you know, you've got to take a bit of a Keynesian approach and they say, oh, well, we've got to limit that because, you know, okay, you know, I accept that it does work, but it's only in this circumstance. And if we do any more, we'll be burdening our grandchildren with debt. Rubbish. There is no debt. The real debt problem is private debt. The fact that, Martin, you know better than I, but, you know, what is the ratio of government debt to household debt? Household debt leaves it in the dust, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Yeah, they are. We've got some of the highest household debt anywhere in the world, and it's been rising quite significantly. And of course, the big myth is that affordability is better than it was. Well, not really. Interest rates are lower, but the average loan is a lot bigger, 15% bigger for a first-time buyer than a year ago. So we are up to our gills in debt. And now we're seeing the first signs of interest rates perhaps moving a little higher. CBA moved their rates today. So this is a long, slow burn, but it's not actually heading in the right direction, in my view.
Absolutely. No, I agree completely.
So here's another one, which is sort of picking up, I think, from what you said about what about establishing an Australian post bank?
An Australian post bank?
Yeah, so the idea is the public bank would be actually based in the Australia Post organisation, and it goes all through the branch network that it already has.
Why not? I mean, that's going back to almost the 1920s, isn't it, where that sort of thing existed.
There's a Kiwi bank in New Zealand, right, which is actually, through the postal system, and it's a very simple way of establishing effectively a public bank through an outlet network that already exists.
It already exists, yeah. No, well, I hadn't thought of it, but it makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So it's a very interesting comments from people who are very much in support of your policies and ideas, and others I think, what's going on here, right? So it's quite interesting. I won't relay all those to you, but we're at 9:22. There are a couple of issues that came up from before the show. One which was people were interested in. We had a conversation with another politician on a few months ago, and he was advocating nuclear power as a better alternative than the oil-based or coal-based power. Do you have a policy on nuclear power?
Yeah, well, we don't see any need for it whatsoever. I mean, it probably is better than fossil fuel, but you don't need it, and you don't need the costs and the risks that go along with that. We have perfectly good models based on wind and sun and water and all sorts of renewables that are available now. It seems to be the default position of people who see their days of fossil fuel disappearing, and they want to default to something that sounds a bit better, and somehow they prefer that. I don't know why. It's not needed. If it were needed, you'd consider it,
Yeah, I've been quite surprised by the strength of argument in favour of nuclear power, but, just think of Chernobyl and think of some of the other issues, and, there are alternatives.
Why would you take that sort of, I was lying out in the sun in the one sunny day in a summer in London when Chernobyl happened, and the plume was dropping its sweet petals all over me. I don't know whether I'm going to implode in the next week or so because of that, but that was a horrendous thing, and there's been a lot of other examples, and you just don't need it.
No, absolutely, very interesting there. And I, of course, was also in the UK at the time. I remember going to the Lake District, which is a very beautiful part of the UK, a year or so later, and talking to somebody over on the West Coast, because there was a facility there to deal with nuclear waste. All the alarms went off at that centre, right? Not for the local leak, but because of Chernobyl.
Jeez. Yeah, okay, that makes
which got them pretty scared.
Wow, yeah.
Look, last question for tonight, I think, is going to be this, and that is, we are part of an interesting global structure where we've got China and a lot of our trade up in China, and we've got the US, where, of course, ideologically we've got significant alignment. I feel we're caught somewhere in between. So there's a whole policy question about international policy. Now, it may be too early in the development of that for your party, but I'd be interested in your perspective in terms of how you see Australia's position vis-a-vis those big superpowers and its position in the world.
Well, you're right. We don't have a policy on that. We've got a wonderful man, Mr. Hames, who is now our Foreign Affairs Senior Policy Advisor, Richard Hames, and he is looking at developing, a definitive answer to that very question as his first concern. But I think personally, it seems to me that, like everything else in modern politics, logic seems to go out the door. Surely, if you look at China, they are both a threat and a trading partner, and a smart Australian government would keep up strong diplomatic relationships with China whilst at the same time building a strong defence system and alliance with countries in the region. And there's very little to be gained, I think, by rattling sabres at 1.2 million people in a nuclear power. So I think that's bad. When Trump, as far as America is concerned, when Trump was in, I despaired, and I felt that he'd made it very clear that he wasn't interested in the Asia Pacific region, and we could all go to buggery. So I didn't really see any point in any sort of reliance on the Americans. That may have changed now, but I guess the bottom line is you play smart. You don't put Peter Dutton as your defence minister and have him rattle sabres at China. You play smart. You invest time and energy in good diplomatic relations, and watch your back with some proper and appropriate defence strategies that we don't have at the moment. I don't have time to go into telling you what we would do instead on the defence front, but that would be the balance I think that you'd have to take, and that's what diplomacy's been about for like 5,000 years, keeping the balance but protecting your back at the same time.
Absolutely. Well, we're coming to the end, so just to sort of round this off, right? You've got to assume that the election is probably now going to be May next year, right?
Yeah.
So you've got a road to go between now and then to try and position yourself. What's your strategy? Is it presumably to occupy a balance of power the first time around? And how many candidates are you likely to field? And, it'd be interesting to get a sense of that from you.
Yeah, well, we're going to field, of course, senators. But in the lower house, we've identified, and our experts have identified, about 3 dozen Liberal-held seats where we believe as much as 20% of the Liberal vote, or 20% of the voters in that seat are moderate, disaffected Liberals who really detest what this government's doing, and they're looking for a real Liberal Party, and they will come across to us. Now, if that is true, then that should put us in second position. And provided the Labor Party doesn't preference the Liberal Party over us, that should be enough to win us those seats. Now, that's in theory. That's in theory, and that's not going to happen because you have to accept that things will go wrong all over the place. But I think there's a real chance that we will get somewhere between 3 and 5 seats in the lower house off the Liberal Party. At the same time, the Greens will I think, take another 4 or 5 in central Melbourne and Brisbane off the Labor Party. And there will be a very, very strong crossbench of maybe 20 people when it's us and the Greens and the Independents. And we'd be really looking forward to working with all those people to try and keep the bastards honest in the first place. And hopefully, if we can show that we do that and that we gain people's confidence, then we can hopefully make government in the election after that. So that would be our aim, and it's our declared position that we would make it a condition of cooperation that a proper ICAC with real teeth was introduced as a first priority.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and perspectives with I hope you've not found it too confronting to sort of just take them. But, thank you for being so open.
Not at all. It's been great fun, as always. I love talking to you. So thank you so much for having me.
And if people want to find out more about the New Liberals, what's the best place to go?
Just Google the New Liberals and it'll take you straight to the website.
Terrific. Well, Victor, thank you very much for your time this evening. I'm going to now take you offline and I'll just close out the full show. So thank you very much for the hour and a half. It's gone very, very quickly.
It has. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you. See you soon. So there you are, folks. Interesting conversation from Victor and very interesting perspectives, of course, there too. We're pretty much up against the close of the show now. So just to tell you that next week, we're going to have Amanda Farmer on. And she's a lawyer and she specialises in strata. So we're going to go and look at strata property and all the issues around that. That'll be an interesting conversation. And again, you'll be able to join us live and ask questions live. So I hope that you find that interesting. And you can always send questions through ahead of time or live on the show. And without further ado, I want to say thank you all very much for spending an hour and a half with us this evening. And I hope you have a good evening. Keep safe. And I'll look forward to seeing you same time next week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.